Hello, Patrick. David, if you could just take a seat here.
Oh, okay, sure.
So we'll start with you, Patrick. If you could just tell us a bit about what you do at SIACI Saint-Honor.
Well, I am a risk analyst. I am coming from the world of sport. I am a fencer, so I know a little about mask, casque, helmets. My job is to fight in order to protect the athletes. My job is to define what are the risks and to avoid this risk and to protect the health of the athletes. It is even if I am an insurance guy and if I have to sell insurance sometimes, I really prefer to protect the athlete, to protect the organizing bodies, the international body who organize the sport. And also I try to fight sometimes against the athletes themselves who are ready to take too much risk and to put themselves in a dangerous situation.
Okay. And I suppose, Dave, in a similar way, you're trying to protect athletes too, but yours is more sort of protective gear that you work on. So if you could just say a couple of words about what you do.
Exactly. And Patrick, our motto is protect the athlete, elevate the game. So I am co-founder and CEO of a company called VICIS, which our first product was introduced a couple of years ago. It was the number one ranked helmet in the National Football League each of the last 3 years. VICIS means change, so we're trying to introduce change into the protective equipment space, mainly by bringing technology to bear. So my background is in medical technology, and we've also hired a lot of folks from aerospace. We're based in Seattle, Washington, which is the home of Boeing. And we're eager now to expand into Europe and to address head health in more traditional European sports like rugby and football. And in fact, we hired our first European employee, and we've, at least we're in the process of setting up an entity right here in the Canton. So we appreciate all the help and support that we've received from ThinkSport and as well from Dev with the Canton.
So, Patrick, I'll go to you if you don't mind first. In terms of that relationship between, I suppose, as an insurer, but more generally as someone trying to protect an athlete, how far is the athlete their own worst enemy in this sort of thing? I mean, obviously, the athlete wants to win, and that's it for them. And how far can you get involved and stop an athlete from competing when they really desperately want to?
It's a difficult question. Now, sport is driven by a lot of aspects, in particular to go faster, quicker, and so on. Our target is also to help the athlete to do that, but also to analyze the risk before the risk happens, in order to be sure that it is not risky to go in this situation. To be frank with you, it's not very easy because we have to reinvent what could happen. I have an interesting example about boxing, for example. You remember perhaps that during the Olympic Games in 2008 and 12, boxing, all the boxers have an helmet, and the International Federation decide to delete this helmet. I was very surprised, and I say, you are more than crazy. They were not crazy. They did the right decision because now we have much less concussion, 40% less, than what we have in the past. Just because we delete the helmet, sorry for that, and because the boxing system, the boxing methodology changed totally. So it means that the protection is something more than important, but perhaps we have also to think about the rules in order to change the rules. What happened in rugby, for example, the rules change very, very often just to protect the athletes. This is my target, to protect the athletes. If you do not protect the athlete, you do not protect the sport, and it is the end of the sport.
Just to take up on that, if I may, just the boxing example that you raised, Patrick. So a lot of people ask us in American football, when we've made the helmet more effective, does that lead players to play more aggressively? And does that counteract the benefit of the improved protection offered by the helmet? And our view is that equipment is just part of the solution. There needs to be a basket of things that change. Better equipment, rule changes, better coaching techniques, different ways of practicing. All of those things come together to better protect the athlete. And I don't think we can necessarily negate headgear altogether. I don't know what study was conducted that suggested that head safety improved in boxing because headgear was removed. But we have sports today that don't have any sort of headgear, and yet they have quite high rates of head injury, football being one of them here in Europe. So I think we have to look at it holistically, training, technique, all of those things in addition to better equipment.
Yep, absolutely. And on the equipment, obviously, you constantly are trying to make better and better equipment, which, as you said, potentially increases the risk of the athlete throwing themselves in there. How far ahead of that curve are you testing? I mean, how much faster than athletes can run right now are you testing your products at?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of catching up that needs to do in protective equipment. It's typically been an area or category in sporting goods that has not attracted a lot of investment in research and development or technology, frankly. And so helmets, they have a long way to go just to catch up with today's athletes who are already bigger, stronger, and faster. So the way we test our helmets today, we have a fairly sophisticated test laboratory where with instrumented head forms where we can impact the helmets at a range of velocities and locations. And we tend to test them at the velocities observed in professional play, so at the most rigorous. But that could be bad, though, if you're also developing a helmet for kids and they have lower impact velocities. So you really have to tune the helmets for those athletes and the conditions they experience on field.
Okay, and on the sort of testing side of things and where you're getting that data from, I suppose in your business, in the insurance business, you must have to be working very closely with, are you working with teams? Are you working with governing bodies?
So we try to work with the governing bodies. I just would like to give you an example. Around 15 years ago, I wrote an article about concussion in sport. Nobody reads the article. It was not really, perhaps in the US, but certainly not in Europe. It was not an interesting article. It was too dangerous, explaining too many things which are not true. Yes, unfortunately, they were more than true. 5 years ago, here in Lausanne, I organized a seminar about concussion with 35 international federations. Everybody was interested because we, at that time, 5 years ago, first of all, we analyzed the situation, and it was clear that concussion is a sort of bombing on which the international governing bodies are seated. Perhaps you remember a long, long time ago, we have a big example, which is asbestos. Well, it's an old story, which represents today 10, 20, 50 billion US dollar future claims. Concussion is the same thing, more or less, at the sport level. It represents 6, 7, 10, I don't know, billion dollars in terms of risk. How we can accept discussing with the governing body to stay in this type of situation is not acceptable. It's not acceptable for the future of the governing body. It's not acceptable for the future of sport.
And did you find the same over the pond? I mean, obviously, we know now that this could be an issue, as we just heard, that could cost billions and billions for the sports organisers. I suppose the NFL would be your main one that you're working with. And I can imagine you have had kickback when you were trying to get moving with increasing the technology and trying to protect players more. And how far has that evolved in the time that you've been working on it, that they're actually maybe willing to work with you, or are they still kicking back?
Mm-hmm. Well, having lived in the U.S. and Europe, I do understand the U.S. is a bit crazy in terms of the litigiousness of the society and being risk averse. But the NFL is likely the most advanced league in terms of understanding the risks to the sport and embracing technologies like ours. They, in fact, started a grant program to identify and nurture emerging protective technologies like ours, and we benefited from that. But you're now seeing that in other sports. So in the NHL, that commissioner was called before the government of Canada, having to explain what measures they're taking to improve player safety. There's been a lawsuit by former players against the National Hockey League. But it's also here in Europe now. I think there are legitimate concerns about player compensation in football and rugby, and those governing bodies are having to be more attentive to it. It's not just a risk issue, it's obviously a human issue, wanting to protect the players, but it's also a business issue. If the sports are viewed as unsafe, if head injury rates don't decline, then participation is going to go down, fan interest in the sports is going to go down, and I think worse, if there's outcry over how governing bodies are addressing head injury, such as happens when popular football players return to play. Jan Verstegen was one example, and Fabian Schär, a Swiss player, is another. That might lead to government stepping in and legislating the sport, which I don't think the sports want. So proactivity is really the way to go.
And on that, obviously sort of big headline examples of players getting injured, not being able to play the next week. That, I mean, speaking as a viewer of sport, that seems to change every other week. One week it's player shouldn't play for a month if they've been concussed. The next week it's they shouldn't play for 2 days. The next week it's the doctor makes the call on the pitch. Do you feel like that's changing so quickly because there's research going on all the time, or do you feel slightly ahead of that curve, or how do you feel?
Concussion is still not well understood. So we need things like are coming out of this startup challenge here to help with diagnosis and player tracking and so on. All of that has to mature. Sensors have to get better as well. So none of that is really where it needs to be.
Okay, and do you feel the same? And is that the same across every sport, or are there some sports that you think particularly are actually they're ahead of the curve? I use the same phrase, that are really sort of advancing things.
I think you, unfortunately, you do not have any sport which are not linked with a risk. More or less, how I can say that, extensive or dangerous. But all the sports are linked with some type of risk. The question is, are we able to analyze this risk before the risk happens? This is our job. We try. Perhaps we have some success in 75% of the case, but we have 25% of the case. We are not able to analyze the exact situation because we have no data, we have no past. We have to recreate the past to understand the risk. It's sometimes very, very difficult. It's costly, it's a very time-consuming, but this is the only way in order to avoid that very young people practice sport in a very dangerous situation. When I was a long time ago, very, very young, I practiced rugby. I was 6 or 7 years old. What I did at that time, now I am thinking about what I did. I was totally crazy. Nobody asked me, please don't do that. I did, stupidly. So I was a kid, and nobody was able to tell me, this is dangerous, please stop. Because at that time, it was not dangerous.
And I suppose that even goes straight through to now. Elite athletes, I suppose, are childlike in a way, in that they're just out there competing like kids are. Sorry, you wanted to add something?
Well, what I wanted to add is I think rugby is really interesting because this is a traditionally non-helmeted sport. It has a fairly healthy rate of head injury, and they're really out there trying to determine what to do. You know, they're cautious about adding headgear because they don't want to impact the integrity of the game or change how the game is played. And they're out exploring. They're here at the Spot conference, for example. So it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves over the next few years. But you're right, elite athletes set the tone, and the kids follow elite athletes. And so they're really important examples to other players in their respective sports. And as a headgear and helmet maker, we not only have to make the headgear such that it's more protective, we also have to make it such that the style is there, the comfort is there, the breathability, the wearability, so elite athletes are drawn to it and want to wear it. So it's definitely a consideration.
Okay, interesting. And we talked about sort of children and young people and grassroots sport. How far can you see it going in terms of, we'll stick to concussion because I suppose it's the big key word here. How far do you think that eventually there will have to be doctors on the side of the field during kids' games, or how far do you see it going?
Well, I hope not. I think first of all, it's expensive and probably likely difficult. And what's ironic about the whole thing is that the age group we most want to protect, the kids, have the fewest resources deployed against them in play, whereas the professional athletes have all the sideline neurosurgeons and the spotters and everything else. So we need to balance that out for sure. But I think with better equipment and better coaching and technique and greater awareness, I think in general, all the sports are going to get more safe.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much for your time. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd just like to say thanks again to Dave and to Patrick.
Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.